everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Kevin Blekicki Show in junction with the Ryan Show. I am your host, Kevin Blekicki. We have another great show for you this week. I am going to spend the entirety of this episode talking about the New York Mets. I'm going to be recapping their last couple of series and previewing what they're going to have to do this weekend against the Miami Marlins. And unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about any football because the Mets have just taken up so much of my life. So I won't be able to talk about South Carolina struggling early in the season. I won't be talking about Dabo Swinney having rumors of him getting fired at Clemson, as much as that would bring me joy. Shout out Notre Dame for getting their first win of the season against Purdue. How they're still ranked is beyond me, but they are. The AP poll has been really bad this year. But we're just going to talk about pennant race baseball featuring the New York Mets. At the time of this recording, they are 81-77, which gives them a one-game lead over the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Cincinnati Reds in the National League wild card, as well as a 3.5-game lead over the Giants and Cardinals. And the Miami Marlins are still mathematically alive, 4 games back with 4 to go in the season. And the Mets have a magic number of 4 left with 4 games left in the season. So they control their own destiny. If the Mets win their next 4 games, regardless of what happens with the Reds or the Diamondbacks, the Mets will make the playoffs. The only thing is that it's the frickin' New York Mets, and they will do anything and everything in their power to make sure that this experience is as painful for Mets fans as humanly possible. And the tone of this episode is based entirely on when I chose to record it. If I had recorded this episode before the first game of the Cubs series, I would have been pissed. I would have been very angry and upset and thought that the season was over because the Mets had just lost 2 out of 3 at home to the Washington Nationals. If I had waited a couple of hours to post to film an episode, I would have been over the moon because it would have been the best one of the season for the Mets, as they were down 6-1 to the Chicago Cubs at Wrigley Field, and they managed to come all the way back and win the game 9-7 thanks to a 2-run home run by Francisco Alvarez. But since I wasn't able to make the episode after Game 1, and I'm making the episode after Game 2, the Mets got blown out 10-3 in Game 2 on national television on ESPN. So now the episode isn't going to be as fun. However, shout out to Paul Skeens and the Pittsburgh Pirates for taking the first 2 games of the series against the Reds. So the Mets are still in control of that wild card spot. They do not have the tiebreaker over the Diamondbacks or the Reds. So the Mets have to finish with a better record than them, because if they have the same record as either of those 2 teams, the Mets will not make the playoffs because they don't hold the tiebreaker against them. So these next 4 games are incredibly important for the New York Metropolitans. And if I know anything about rooting for this team this year, they will do anything and everything in their power to make sure this is the most painful experience humanly possible. Jonathan went out there in Game 2 of the series, and he got roughed up really bad. And I really feel bad for Jonathan because he was put in an impossible situation. And really have all of the 3 Mets rookie pitchers, Nolan McLean and Brandon Sproat, they've all been put into a very difficult position because the rest of the Mets rotation is literally useless. David Peterson, earlier in this season, was an all-star. He threw a complete game shutout and also went 8 innings in a different start earlier this season, and his most recent start, he couldn't get out of the second inning. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. He has completely hit a wall. He is terrible. His ERA has been almost at 7 since the beginning of August. I mean, he has been absolutely atrocious every single time that he goes out on the mound the last couple of months. So David Peterson, who is someone who is considered to be the ace of this Mets rotation and really was the only one who was putting together starts where he would consistently go 6 innings, now all of a sudden needs to rely on the rookies to pick up the slack because he can no longer go deep or even remotely decent into games, not even deep. He can't even go 4 or 5 innings. That dude went 1 1/3 in his most recent start in game 1 against the Chicago Cubs. And that is going to be the downfall of this Mets team. Their pitching is absolutely atrocious. I don't know what the record is, but I feel like the Mets, if they are not setting the record, they are very close to the record for the most 5-run innings given up by a team in a single season. I don't think I've ever seen a team give up that many 5-run innings in my life. It seems like every time, the game is tied and then you look away and then it's 5-0 or 5-1. And that's exactly what happened in game 1 of this series against the Cubs. The Mets actually had the lead. They were up 1-0, 2 pitches into the game after Francisco Lindor hits a home run. David Peterson in the bottom of the first immediately gives up 2 runs and then gives up more runs in the next couple innings. All of a sudden, it's a 6-1 game, and you're thinking the season's over. And then slowly but surely, the Mets chip away. Brandon Nimmo sets a career high with his 25th home run of the season, and he hit a 3-run homer to tie it. And like I mentioned before, Francisco Alvarez hit a 2-run homer to give the Mets a lead. They tied it at 6. They went up 7-6, and then of course they give the lead right back. And then thankfully Francisco Alvarez took the lead for the Mets, and then they never gave it back. But that was a win that you can finally put your hat on. That is a win that is referred to as like a DVD win, or something that they show like when a team goes on a deep run and maybe wins a championship. Like that's one of the signature wins of the season. The Mets are still 0-66 after trailing after 8 innings. So they haven't had a late game comeback. Even though they came back from 6-1, it was pretty early in the game that they were able to come back. But if the Mets are not scoring like 7, 8, or 9 runs in a game, they're just not going to win it. This pitching staff outside of Nolan McLean has been absolutely useless. Brandon Sproat's been pretty good, but Jonah Tong has had 2 good starts, 2 okay starts, and then the bad start where he didn't even go a full inning. And this most recent start against the Cubs was not good. Jonah Tong definitely was rushed into coming into the major leagues. And if the Mets are unable to make the playoffs, it's going to be very embarrassing. Thank God for the Detroit Tigers absolutely crapping the bed. The Cleveland Guardians were 15.5 games back in the division in, I think, early June, and they've managed to completely erase it. And now at the time of this recording, they are in sole possession of first place in the AL Central. And the Tigers were a team that had the best record in the American League not too long ago. And all of a sudden, now they're fighting for a wild card spot. I mean, that's a disaster. The Dodgers had an 8-game lead in their division. They blew it. They got it back, but they're still in a fight with the Padres for the NL West title. So there's and then you have the Mets, who were up as much as 5 games in the National League East. They had the best record in baseball at one point. They were 20 games over 500, and now they are scraping and fighting just to get a wild card spot, the last wild card spot. So it's crazy how fast things can turn over the course of a baseball season. So it's not just a Mets thing. And I guarantee that if the Mets miss the playoffs, they're gonna have a more media attention on them than the Tigers would, because the Tigers are still gonna make the playoffs. But the Tigers not being the top seed in the American League or not even winning their division is not going to be talked about as much as the Mets, because it's the LOL Mets. This is the same old Mets. They have the biggest payroll in baseball. They paid Juan Soto, a Scrooge McDuck, ton of money, and no matter what happens, it's always going to be LOL Mets. And so far, it hasn't shown any other reason to be other than LOL Mets. I mean, this team is losing games to inexplicably bad teams. The Cubs are a good team. They just got swept in 4 games against the Reds because of course they did. A team in the playoffs just completely laying down to a team that's chasing the Mets. It's a story as old as time. But the Mets losing 2 out of 3 to the Washington Nationals this late in the season is just not okay. And I don't know who in their right mind went into that series thinking that the Mets were going to sweep. Because the Mets are in a situation where they need to win virtually every game that they play in to make the playoffs. There's 4 games left. If they win all 4 of them, they make the playoffs. If they get some help, they might not need all 3 of those games against Miami to make the playoffs. But does anyone have any confidence that this team can pull off 4 consecutive wins? This is a team that is built on inconsistency, and they will do anything in their power to make sure that this season is as painful as possible. There is no team that I've ever rooted for in my life that I hate more than the Mets, the 2025 Mets, because their offense has been great this season. They have 4 separate 25 home run hitters. Soto, Nimmo, Lindor, and Alonso have all hit over 25 home runs. Lindor is close to being a 30-30 player, and Soto can also be a 40-40 player. He has surpassed his career high that he set last year for home runs. Pete Alonso has well over 100 RBIs. Juan Soto has 40 home runs, 30 stolen bases, 100 RBIs, and 100 walks, which has never been done in the history of this franchise. He has been every single bit of as good as advertised with his contract, and it might not even matter. And the reason why it's not going to matter is because David Stearns did not do a good enough job assembling this rotation. In my preseason prediction, I said that the Mets were going to be about an 85-win team, and they were going to be fighting for a last wild card spot. And if they win out, that's exactly what would happen. They would win 85 games, and they would be in the last wild card spot. But it's crazy that it got to this point, considering how good they were earlier in the season. And the reason why I said that they were only going to win like 85 games or so is because I didn't trust this rotation. And granted, they've had a lot of injuries. Griffin Canning went down for the season. Sean Manaea's missed significant time. Kodai Senga missed significant time. Tyler McGill's missed significant time. This is a team that's been banged up a lot. And then you also go to the rotation. Not the rotation, the bullpen. AJ Minter has been out for the year. So they've had a lot of injuries, and David Stearns just has not done enough to fill this rotation, and right now they're paying for it. But that does it for the first part of this edition of the Kevin Blekicki Show. We will be back after these messages. We are back with more of the Kevin Blekicki Show in junction with the Ryan Show. So I posed to the audience a question. Are the Mets going to make the playoffs? In my humble opinion, I don't think that they are. One, they don't deserve to. They do not deserve to make the playoffs after losing 2 out of 3 to the Washington Nationals. Every time I look up, they're giving up more runs. This pitching is horrendous, and on the days that they do pitch, their offense decides to not show up. So, they're in a position where while they technically do control their own destiny, I think it's going to be based entirely on how good the Cincinnati Reds do. The Cincinnati Reds have to play one more game against the Pirates, and then they have to play the Brewers. Now, the Brewers are a team that have had the division locked up for a hot minute now. They're going to have some time off between the wild card series and the NLDS. So, maybe they play their starters and they actually try hard and they go hard this weekend, knowing that they have some time off and try and build as much momentum as they can before the postseason starts, or they can just completely lay down and lay an egg and get swept like the Chicago Cubs did against the Reds and forcing the Mets to sweep the Marlins as well. The Marlins, they're not a terrible team. As I mentioned before, they are 4 games out of a wild card spot. So they are still technically in this game. So they are going to, should they win on Thursday, they line themselves up for a scenario which they could be playing against the Mets for a wild card spot. So, you thought that this would be a potential spoiler scenario where the Marlins have nothing to play for and they're just gonna, play loose and try and catch the Mets slipping and try and ruin their playoff hopes. But this is a team that could make the playoffs if they sweep the Mets, which is definitely a non-zero chance of that happening. If the Mets can get swept by the Pirates, if the Mets can lose 2 out of 3 to the Nationals, they've already lost a 3 out of 4 to the Marlins in the last series that they played at Citi Field. It is entirely possible that the Marlins get the win on Thursday. The Mets lose. The Marlins are 3 games back, and then they sweep the Mets. The Marlins are also moving Sandy Alcantara back from making his originally scheduled start earlier in the week on Thursday to Friday, just so he can pitch in the series against the Mets. So the Marlins are still fighting. They're still in a playoff spot. So it's not going to be easy for the Mets. And this Mets rotation is just so bad that you just expect that the Mets have to score 6 or 7 runs every single time out, except for maybe when Nolan McLean pitches, which he pitches on Thursday. He's going up against Shota Imanaga. So, the Mets do have the advantage there in the pitching matchup. But, you got Brandon Sproat going on Friday against the Marlins. On Saturday, it was supposed to be Clay Holmes and Sean Manaea, but those guys pitched in Game 2 of the series against the Cubs on Wednesday. For what? The game was already out of reach, and now both pitchers pitched under 20 pitches. They only went 1 inning each, so it's not completely taxing. But this is another stupid move from Carlos Mendoza. Why are you wasting 2 valuable starting pitchers in a game that doesn't mean, well, it's not that it doesn't mean anything, but the game was lost at that point. Why are you doing this? I mean, Carlos Mendoza, I don't necessarily know if he deserves to be fired, but if the Mets don't make the playoffs, I think that there's a chance that he might get canned because you're not going to get rid of David Stearns because he just brought in Juan Soto with generational talent for 15 years. Obviously, Steve Cohen's not going to sell the team. You know, you're locked into Lindor, you're locked into Soto, you're locked into Nimmo. And I assume Pete Alonso's coming back. I want Pete Alonso to come back. I want him to finish his career as a New York Met. But who knows at this point? And it's not going to be necessarily fair, especially after how well Carlos Mendoza did last year. But Mendoza's made a lot of stupid mistakes over the course of this season. So he's not exactly sitting pretty in an ivory tower with complete job security at this point. He needs to keep an eye out. If the Mets do miss the playoffs, there needs to be heads that have to roll because this is just inexcusable. I mean, the fact that if the Mets were just competent against bad teams, they're not in this position. They probably, if they don't have a wild card spot almost secured, they could have had it locked up a while ago if they just played good baseball against bad teams. But this team refuses to do that. I actually thought that the season was over when Jacob Young made what was quite possibly one of the craziest plays that I've ever seen in center field. The ball is hit to him. He crashes. He makes the catch. He crashes into the wall. He loses control of the ball. He kicks the ball off of his foot, and then it lands in his glove. It is completely lucky. It's a 1 in a million catch that he made, and it just so happened to be against a bottom dweller team when the Mets were in the middle of a playoff race at home in a game that they can't lose, and they ended up losing it. So this team does not deserve to make the playoffs. I was actually thinking that if the Mets were able to sneak in, that they might actually have an outside chance of possibly making the NLCS because the wild card series is only 3 games. And I was thinking that at the time you could just put in Nolan McLean, Brandon Sproat, and Jonah Tong, or maybe David Peterson, and that everything would be okay. And you'd only be playing 3. Yeah, you'd be playing the Dodgers, and you'd be playing on the road, which is not something that the Mets do well this season. But you'd have 3 guys that the Dodgers have never faced. And the Mets did play the Dodgers earlier this season. They won the season series 4-3. And they were the better team in all 7 games. And they easily could have won all of them, but they ended up blowing them. So it's a winnable series. You only have to win 2 games. You throw, and even still, you just throw Nolan McLean and Brandon Sproat in there, and you feel pretty good about your chances. But now Jonah Tong has struggled more and more. Manaea and Holmes are kind of questionable. You don't really know what you're going to get from them. And then, so I think that they could win the first series, and then the NLDS is just a best of 5. And you'd be playing the Phillies again. You beat them last year. You can, the Mets are better offensively this year than they were last year. And like I said, you only have to win 3 games. You could throw out those 3 young stars. And I was thinking this about a few weeks ago, and I would feel pretty confident about the Mets in that scenario. But now, in just the span of a couple of short weeks, I don't trust Jonah Tong to make a playoff start. I don't trust David Peterson to make a playoff start. Holmes and Manaea, again, kind of iffy. And, Nolan McLean has been mowing down everybody since he came up to the major leagues who's to say that he doesn't crap the bed in a playoff game? You don't know that he won't do that, and he would totally have the right to do that because he's done so much good for this team that he is allowed to have a stinker in a big moment because he's a rookie. And I think ultimately what's going to come down to whether or not, the Mets do well, like I said, is going to be their starting pitching. But the reason why they would miss the playoffs would be because of David Stearns. And I'm not saying that he should lose his job. I'm not saying that he's necessarily bad at his job, but he didn't do enough to solidify this rotation. And when I said early in the season that that I thought that the rotation was going to be what was preventing this team, I ended up being right. And this team has had a lot of injuries, as I mentioned earlier in this show, but they didn't do anything at the trade deadline to address this rotation. And that was because they saw that these three young starting pitchers were doing so well in the minors that they didn't have to use their prospects to trade for a rental when they had the prospects already there. And I think that Jonah Tong is going to end up being a successful major leaguer. I think that Nolan McLean is going to be a successful major leaguer. Brandon Sproat probably as well. But it's not fair that you're throwing these guys into a playoff race where they have to be essentially perfect every single start because the rest of your starting rotation is completely inept. It's not fair to them. So when I see Jonah Tong getting shelled against the Rangers and against the Chicago Cubs, I feel bad for him because he doesn't deserve to be in that position. So, at the end of the day, it is on the players for their performance. But I think most of the blame, should this team collapse, should fall on the shoulders of David Stearns. And when the offseason comes, I either want to see him completely go with the youth movement, have these three guys, throw in Christian Scott when he comes back from his injury, just really rely on young starting pitching, or you got to go out and do something like a Paul Skeens or just get a reliable arm, because starting pitching is the most important part of a team. If your starter gives up a lot of runs early in the game, it throws everything off, because that means that you have to start relying on your bullpen arms earlier, and their arms are going to be taxed. They're going to have more wear and tear on their arms. That means that your offense is going to have to start pressing because they're already down by so many runs immediately in the game, and that's not fair to them. If you have good starting pitching, it can only set your team up for more success. It is so much easier to come back from a 2 or 3 run deficit than a 9 or 10 run deficit. So that is the area that the Mets need to rely on the most. And as far as the other areas for David Stearns, look, his trade deadline was abysmal. Cedric Mullins has been horrible. Maybe one of the worst midseason acquisitions in the history of this team. Ryan Helsley's also been terrible. He's been better. You have to give him credit. He's been better the last couple of outings, but most of all, he's been really terrible, probably because he's tipping his pitches. Tyler Rogers has been hit or miss. Gregory Soto's been hit or miss. And a bullpen that you thought was going to be really good and really dangerous and really help out this rotation hasn't been as good as as advertised. And that's not David Stearns' fault. I mean, it was objectively a bad deadline, but you can't really blame him for the players that he acquired for being bad. That's on them for being bad. But it is on David Stearns for not setting up this rotation in a way where this team can be successful. So all in all, to wrap this episode up, I pray on my hands and knees that this Mets team can make the playoffs. If they get in, maybe they can make a run. but my expectations are they're going to crap the bed against the Miami Marlins, and this is going to be all for naught, and heads are going to roll, and it's going to be a very interesting offseason. But that does it for this edition of the Kevin Blekicki Show. Thank you for tuning in this week. As always, you can find me everywhere on the internet at Kevin Blekicki, and I will be able to see you guys next week. So let's go. Have a good week.